All right, I'm here with John Buck, and we'll be doing a little bit of a devil's advocate debate on the luck objection to libertarian free will. And we both hold to libertarian free will, but we kind of wanted to hash out this argument that gets made against it. So yeah, what I'm going to do then is, or John, did you want to share anything about your channel or anything before we start?
No, still nothing's really gone on with that. I did a little bit more writing on my epistemology video, but don't get your hopes up. But it will eventually come out. I know I've been saying that for like a year and a half, but just keep waiting. It'll happen.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and present a couple of versions of this objection, and then John will respond, and I'll push back a little bit, and then maybe we'll reverse roles or whatever. Okay, let's go ahead and start. So I'm just going to read out the thing, and then if we need to put it on the screen, we can.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the way I'm formulating it is, if one always chooses what they desire most, and one has no libertarian freedom over what they desire most, then one has no libertarian freedom over what they choose. Premise 2, one always chooses what they desire most, and one has no libertarian freedom over what they desire most. Conclusion, therefore one has no libertarian freedom over what they choose. So the idea would be that our desires elicit and determine our choices. Now, you can argue that one can choose what they don't desire most, but that seems incoherent, because if you don't desire outcome X over outcome Y, then there's no impetus to choose outcome X over outcome Y. And so the choice of X would simply be inexplicable and thereby seem random. But if you grant that one does choose what they desire most, then it seems that there needs to be a reason why they desire that option over another option. Or again, the choice seems inexplicable and random. But the desire to desire option X over option Y, or vice versa, is itself another desire, which then just re-raises the same problem all over again, that desire then you don't have libertarian control over. So again, it then seems determined or random. Or you could just simply bite the bullet and argue that there is no impetus to desire option X over option Y, and a person just picks X or just picks Y without any extra impetus favoring one option over the other. But then that choice ultimately seems random, because there would be no ultimate motivating factor for picking X over Y or vice versa. But then a person's just simply lucky for picking the morally right choice. So libertarian free will ends up amounting to moral choices simply being random and thereby a matter of luck, which doesn't seem like it applies to reality. It also would undermine moral responsibility.
All right, so I think just from that, I have like two different ways in which I could theoretically respond. I think that like one is not beholden to accepting the fact that for any choice one makes, one most desired that choice over all others. It could very well be the case that one has to your avail like two options that both have an equal level of desire within you. Let's say I am hungry for some food, and I have before me an apple and an orange, and I desire apples and oranges at an equal level. And so I can choose between either of those options and I do choose between either of those options, and I don't have any ultimate desire over one over the other. And I don't see it as being like incoherent to say that I choose to eat an orange when I also had a strong desire to eat an apple instead.
But would you say that your desire to eat the orange thereby is not greater than your desire to eat the apple?
Right. Yeah, I would just say that it's at an equal level as the desire to eat the apple.
Right. So then I think that the argument could maybe be reformulated, and this was in my follow-up version, which this may not be better, but this is another way it could then be put. The mind always chooses what makes the most sense to it. One doesn't have libertarian free will over what makes the most sense to their mind. Therefore, one doesn't have libertarian free will over what they choose. I think that's valid. But how would you respond to that?
Would that be like the mind always? So what it means to say that makes the most sense to it. Usually, that like I take that as like interpreting of some data. But you're saying rather that like the mind only does whatever like it sees most fitting, maybe something sort of like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's open to interpretation, and that's why it's kind of a rabbit hole. But
and so, in which
yeah, I
case,
mean, I guess if you're not going to say you pick something because you desire it more, then it seems like there's got to be some rationale, so it's not just utterly inexplicable. Because like if you said like you kick somebody and that there was literally no explanation as to why, we wouldn't really say that's a free choice. At least it would seem. But so like what? And I mean, obviously, at some point, I think this is going to beg the question in favor of determinism. So that's kind of where that. Well, we'll get there.
Okay. Well,
but yeah.
Maybe.
So what would you say is the reason why you, or explanation why you made one choice over another?
I guess you could say, like, even in the circumstance where I said, like, you have an equal desire to eat an apple and or to eat an orange, you could just say that, okay, well, it's going to be indeterminate then, or sorry, it's going to be like there's going to be no explanation as to why you ate an apple versus eating an orange, and so you would still have that sort of luck or randomness objection, and so anything that's random is not going to be up to your decision making. But I think that well, maybe that would be me responding to like I would respond to that by just saying that, like, okay, we're going to have to clarify what it means to say that something is random. I take it that something is random if it was not determined by antecedent conditions and it was not up to any agent in order for it to occur. I would say that my choosing to eat an apple or to eat an orange would be something that would be up to me, the agent, in order for it to occur. And so it would not qualify as being random, but it would qualify as being indetermined by the antecedent conditions do not necessitate it's occurring that I eat an apple versus eating an orange, given that like circumstance. But maybe you want to elaborate your objection further.
Right. So I guess, well, I'm just trying to put myself in the determinist position. If you're going to say you don't pick the orange because you desire it more. You don't pick it because it makes more sense to you. Would you say you just pick it because that's what you did with your will? Would you say, is that like a fair way to summarize?
Yeah, I would say that like I have a motivation to eat something, and so I have a reason to act either in eating an apple or eating an orange. Like both of those actions would be consistent with my reasons for acting. And then, yeah, I just make an arbitrary decision between those two options to work off of. But it would still be something that is up to me, and so it wouldn't qualify as a random event. And so,
do you think you could have chosen not to eat anything at all?
I would just say, like, per this specific circumstance, I'll just deny that, and I'll say that no, like I had to eat something. I had both an apple or an orange available to me, and I chose one of them arbitrarily between those two options.
Okay. Well, I guess you want to make, it seems like you would want, in order to maintain moral responsibility, you would want to action net a little wider, because what if you said, well, it wasn't up to me to rob the bank, but what weapon I used, that was up to me. We wouldn't say like you are morally responsible.
Yeah. If we wanted to like draw out instead of a sort of arbitrary use of the free will towards moral responsibility, I could just say, okay, I'm in some circumstance where I have moral reason to refrain from doing some action, and I have I don't know, a sort of disposition towards performing that action. And so I would have both reasons to do X and also reasons to do not X, neither one overpowering the other. And then I make a sort of arbitrary decision between those two, whether I act morally or I act selfishly.
And when you say arbitrary, what exactly do you mean by that?
Right. I would mean that
arbitrary.
the agent would arbitrate between those two decisions, between those two options to finalize it into some sort of outcome. Sort of like I would be the arbitrator of it, rather than saying that like, oh, I just threw my hands up in the air and then it happened one way or the other. It's something that I, as the agent, decide between.
But I guess the determinist will say, well, what motivates choosing the apple over the orange, or not robbing the bank over robbing the bank? Like, do you elicit that motivation from yourself, or
right?
does it come from something else?
I mean, if we're like trying to theme the show around the luck objection, it seems like we're assuming ex hypothesi that determinism is false. Like that's supposed, like, if we want to instead go into like, okay, here, how is it that determinism and free will can be compatible? As an incompatibilist, I'm under no sort of like, I don't have any inclination towards defending a compatibilist view of libertarianism.
Right, but when you're saying you have a motivation, but if the determinist is arguing, well, what explains why you have the motivation to pick one over the other, and if it does seem to be random in this like incoherent or really bizarre sense, then they're going to say that's a good reason to opt for determinism. So I'm just wondering, what do you think the source of, because it sounds to me like you're saying the reason you pick the apple is because you have this extra motivation to pick the apple, but the determinist could say, well, that sounds like a desire to me.
Right. So I would say that I have the motivation in the circumstance of the apple and the orange. I have a motivation both for the apple and the orange, and then I arbitrate between those motivations to act upon one of them. In the same sort of way, if I'm faced with some sort of moral decision, I'm motivated in some way both to act morally and also to act immorally, and then I arbitrate between those two.
And so, but do you think arbitrating requires giving yourself an extra like boost or motivation towards one over the other?
I don't think, like, if you're saying like, there's usually the objection that like, okay, you have some sort of like energy coming out of nowhere, like from the soul or the will or something like that. I would just say that given indeterminism, there are going to be multiple outcomes available given certain circumstances. And then it's just going to be up to, I guess it would be up to whatever subject is there in that circumstance in order to make a decision between those available options. Sorry, what was your question again? I want to make sure I answered it properly.
Like, what's the source of the motivation? So like, if you're motivated to pick one option over another, what is the source of that extra motivation? Do you give yourself that extra motivation? Because it seems like if it comes from outside of you, then it's determinism. So it seems like you would need to be the source of it with your own like agent powers.
Right. I would deny that we have the motivation to do one option over the other. Rather, we have motivations both for this one thing and also for the other. And it's just not the case that one motivation was greater than the other, given some circumstance in which we act freely. It could be the case that there's some circumstances where we have an overpowering motivation to perform some action, and that would just be a situation in which you don't act freely. So, like, where the motivation comes from is just going to be, I don't know, the standard sort of explanation as to where our motivations come from. It could be like through our natural inclinations or evolutionary side effects, or different like moral reasons for performing actions, like if moral reasons are supposed to confer any sort of motivation for actions. So I would just say that you don't have like this welling up of a higher motivation for one thing over the other. Rather, you have multiple motivations available, or like reasons available to you in which to act, and then you choose between those and then act upon some set of motivations.
Yeah. I feel like you wouldn't want to say it's like evolution or something outside of you, because then if you're going to say you do something because of motivations, but then these motivations are things you like inherit, then that would seem to open the door to determinism. So I guess from my perspective, I want to say that I am the source in part of my motivation.
Well, that seems
So
sort
the
of
way,
weird. Like, it seems like our motivation for sex is something that would have been evolutionarily advantageous, and then might have been something that we have as a product of the actions of our ancestors. Similarly, for like our taste and appreciation for certain types of foods that are like high in nutrition or something like that. And I would just say that, yeah, you have the motivations to do these sorts of things, but you also have equally high motivations to do other things, in which case you have the libertarian freedom to choose between those equally high motivations to act.
right. Well, I agree with that, but except then I don't think you could appeal to saying you did the choice because of a motivation if you're then going to say motivations are totally from outside of you. So you either have to deny that motivations are totally outside of you, or you have to say your choice wasn't solely because of motivations. But then I would want to know what, so you see, like, it seems like you have to pick one or the other.
Okay, so like imagine that you have an independently wealthy millionaire that offers you $1,000 to cross the street, and then you have another millionaire that offers you $1,000 to stay put. Now, you have motivations, in which case, to either cross the street or to refrain from crossing the street. And both of those motivations are going to be outside of you, because you yourself don't have the $1,000 yourself. But it's still going to be up to you whether you cross the street and get the $1,000 from the one millionaire versus staying and get the $1,000 from the other millionaire. That would be an instance in which you have motivations that come from outside of you, or like, in some sense, yeah, it seems like the motivations come from outside of you, yet you are able to arbitrate between your decisions and act freely.
All right. I definitely agree that part of the motivations do come from outside of us. Like, I don't decide to find apples tasty. That's just part of my genetics and upbringing and such. But I do feel like picking the apple over the orange, I feel like I must have some kind of power where I do. So the way I would respond to this is like, I have some kind, with my agent power, I can elevate one option over the other. It's not that I like make it taste better or something, but it's just that I use my mind to select one over there. I think, which I think is probably what you're saying. I'm just wondering if adding that word motivate, but then you're saying motivations are outside of you, seems like you're kind of, it sounds like it's having your cake and eating it too on the explanation. But so I'm just wondering about parsing out the language. I mean, personally, I think the argument kind of begs the question, because it seems to assume that our choices just simply submit to one desire over the other. But I would say rather our will is in control, and it's presented with these different, incommensurable attractive options, and then we just say, well, I'm picking this option over this option. And it is arbitrary in the sense that it doesn't have a determination outside of us in the choice, but it's not arbitrary in the sense of it has no rationale or it's totally out of control. The rationale is simply they both look like good options, and I used my will. I willed myself, not even I used, it's just I willed myself to pick one over the other. End of story. Right. That's how I would cash it out. And I just think these arguments kind of, to my mind, just beg the question, because they're looking for a determinant outside of us, as if our will is kind of, it kind of puts the cart before the horse in my mind. It's like our will is just submitting to these extra attractions and such. And I would say that then that's just not what free will is, and that's not what I feel like I experience. So
I will say, though, that I would deny that I would deny that any circumstance in which I have a motivation to do something over another, that I have the freedom to have done otherwise in that circumstance. I just say that we have motivations to perform some action alongside having the motivations to perform some other action. And it's not going to be the case that if I act freely, that I had some higher order motivation over one over the other. Because like it seems like when I have like reasons to do actions, I don't have reasons in relation to other things that are available to me. Rather, I have reasons in regards to this particular action. So like my reasons for eating an apple are going to be facts about the apple that I like and things like that. It's not going to be facts about the apple alongside facts about the orange that I dislike or something like that. Those are going to be independent from my reasons for eating the apple. So like I would have motivations or reasons for eating an apple, and I would also have motivations and reasons for eating the orange. And then between those two, I would choose one over the other. It's not going to be the case that I just have this one single motivation to eat an apple over an orange. Rather, it's just going to be the case that I have both motivations / reasons open to me. That's at least.
Right. Do you want to present your versions of this?
Sure. Give me 1 second. How do I... Let me open this in a new tab. All right. How do I share screen? Share screen. Yes, share screen. No, not this one. All right. There we go. All right. So for any event that occurs, there is either a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily, or it occurs absent a sufficient cause. All right, so that's sort of your either or. I think that's that's a true dichotomy. If an event occurs necessarily, then the event is not free. If the event has no sufficient cause, then no agent caused said event, which is like you and I are both agent causal libertarians. And so if something doesn't have a sufficient cause for its occurring, then the agent wouldn't obviously, it wouldn't be caused due to some agent. So agent causal free will is impossible. What are your sorts of thoughts on that?
Okay, so for any event that occurs, there's either a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily, or occurs without a sufficient cause. If an event occurs necessarily, then the event is not free. If the event has no sufficient cause, then the agent caused no agent caused the event. I don't see why if the event has so if the event has no sufficient cause, then no agent caused said event. I don't see why, or the first thing, if it has a sufficient cause, then it's necessary. I don't see why I should accept that.
So I think
why the necessity.
Yeah, it seems like if you have some sort of like sufficient conditions for an event occurring, then that event will necessarily occur. So like if I have heat, oxygen, and some sort of material, then necessarily fire will occur if it's at like the appropriate level. So that would be a sort of like sufficient conditions for fire, and then necessarily fire will occur in the same sort of way. If you have some sort of like sufficient conditions for some action occurring, then that action will necessarily occur.
Okay, so then I would say that there's kind of an equivocation or a vagueness unnecessary. So something could be contingently necessary, like if I draw a triangle, it will necessarily have 3 sides, but it doesn't thereby follow I necessarily drew a triangle. So something could be conditionally necessary. So if there is these sufficient conditions, then the effect would necessarily follow, but that sufficient condition could be I contingently willed myself to pick X over Y, it would seem. So I would just deny that that second premise. Then if an event occurs necessarily, then the event is not free. If you mean it was necessitated by necessary conditions, then I would agree, but I don't think that follows, at least
rather it was necessitated by like contingent conditions would be
right. So for any event that occurs, there's either a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily. So following necessarily doesn't mean the cause itself was necessary. It just means that the effects from those conditions necessarily followed. I think. So I think there could be a modal fallacy in that first premise.
Wouldn't okay, so determinism is a notion that given some antecedent conditions and the laws of nature, then only one result can occur. But you're going to want to deny determinism, right? So let me see.
Well, that to me is absent from premise one. I mean, premise one is saying if there's a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily. I mean, that doesn't say anything about what brought about that sufficient cause. I mean, you would have to put in something else like past events and laws of nature is the only way to bring about a sufficient cause, something like that, and I would just deny that. So,
all right,
I
so
would probably say premise one is a little bit vague.
All right. So there was a point in which it seemed like you affirmed a contradiction where you have a contingent necessity or something like that. Can you sort of
a conditional necessity? So, okay. Like if I said, if I draw a triangle, then necessarily that shape has three sides. I mean, but it doesn't thereby follow I necessarily chose to draw a triangle. It just means if I chose to draw a triangle, these are going to be the necessary side effects. So if you said, take all of these sufficient conditions, you're necessarily going to get me choosing to debate tonight. Well, sure, but one of those sufficient conditions could be that I libertarianly freely chose to debate. It wouldn't follow that that choice itself was a necessary choice. It just means given all of that, I would necessarily follow that I would debate. So I think you're going from the effect necessarily followed to the cause is thereby necessarily mandated, and that wouldn't follow.
Well, I think
like if X necessarily Y, therefore necessarily X, and that wouldn't logically follow.
Yeah, so I think what I'm trying to do is like only refer to the modality of the event itself. So let's say the event is you choosing to eat an orange. That's what we'll say is a sort of freely chosen event that takes place. So for any event that occurs, either that event will have been necessitated by all prior conditions, or would have had no. Well, let's see. So for any event that occurs, there's either a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily, or it occurs absent of a sufficient cause. So like it was just a brute fact that you chose to eat an orange. But so of those two options, which one are you going with?
Well, I don't want to say it's just a brute fact, like it just happened out of no explanation. But the thing is, premise two, I don't think is properly aligned with premise one, because you say for any event that occurs, there's either a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily, but then in premise two, you're saying if an event occurs necessarily, then the event is not free. But that just doesn't follow, because all that you've said is the effect necessarily followed from the sufficient conditions.
Okay. Well, the premise two is just a conditional still. Like it's going to be an independent premise.
Well, then I just reject premise two. I don't see any reason to accept it.
If an event occurs necessarily, that means it could not have happened otherwise. Then the event is not free. You reject that?
Well, when it's phrased like that, if an event occurs necessarily, like that was a necessary event, right, then I agree that it's not free. But I don't think you get that from premise one, because what you said, for any event that occurs, there's a sufficient cause from which it follows necessarily. But all that entails is if you have that sufficient cause, you're going to get this necessarily effect that necessarily follows, but it doesn't entail that the occurrence of that cause is thereby a necessary occurrence.
All right, so you're saying that something can follow necessarily even though it itself is not a necessary event, right?
Right, so let me rethink, because I think I see what you're getting at. What if you said for any event that occurs, it has a sufficient cause and necessarily follows from that sufficient cause?
Okay.
And then I would say, yeah, then I would just deny that. I think any event that occurs,
Well,
no, wait, sorry. Let me,
yeah,
one second. So if an event that occurs, it necessarily follows. Yeah, that's fine. I still don't think that it follows that any event thereby has a necessary cause. It just means that there are sufficient conditions for that event. I still think that there's like a modal fallacy going on where you jump from these effects necessarily follow from these sufficient conditions to thereby that cause is now by a necessary cause, and that just doesn't follow. It's like the triangle example. If I draw a triangle, it necessarily has three sides. That doesn't, you don't get to then say I necessarily drew the triangle.
Right. Okay. So I think like drawing the distinction between the event being a necessary event, in which case it would not be free, versus the event necessarily following from some set of sufficient causes or sufficient cause or causes, whatever. And those are going to be two different. LFW is libertarian free will. Oh, okay. You just responded. Okay, and so those are going to be sort of like two different modal claims regarding the event. Like it could be the case that the event in the second one, which would be premise one, is a contingent event. Like it could have been otherwise because the sufficient conditions could have been otherwise or something like that. In which case, yeah, it's just not going to be the case that the event will be a necessary one just because it has a set of sufficient conditions. All right.
It'd be like saying if I light a match, then necessarily there will be fire. But it doesn't follow I necessarily lit the match.
Right.
Unless you're assuming determinism and you're just saying every choice is only brought about by prior necessitating conditions, but that's exactly what libertarian free will defenders deny.
Right.
So we're going to say that the causal chain for an agent starts at that agent's free will. They're like the prior conditions can restrict maybe the set of options to like these are the attractive options or whatever, but they don't necessitate one option over another. But let's keep thinking about it. But let's go on to the next one. I think
all right, sure. All right. Let's see. Okay, so this is. Hold on. Okay, for any event. Okay, so 8, 9. So this is like partially derived from Peter Van Inwagen's like a promising argument is what he refers to it as. But I was just rereading it today, and I can't really make heads or tails out of it. But I at least sort of like inspired me to try to develop this. I mean, it's loosely based off of it, but only because I can't really fully understand his actual argument. Okay, if you do not know what you will do at time t2, then whatever you do at time t2 is not up to you. And then premise 2, for any undetermined event that takes place, you cannot know how it will occur prior to its taking place. And that just means like, I think that's something that you would agree with. For any undetermined event that takes place prior to its taking place, you cannot know whether it will take place. And then we're going to say X, some event is an undetermined event, which is going to be necessary for apparently for libertarian free will. And then we're going to say, okay, agent A does not know whether they will do X at time t2 until after said event takes place. And then from there, sorry, I haven't like gotten this.
Okay, I think I get it.
Yeah. So, and then I have causes precede effect just in order to motivate the fact that like you cannot know whether something will occur. In order to know that something will occur, it must be a determined event, something like that, prior to its occurring. Sorry.
So right. I don't see any reason to accept premise 1. If you don't know what you will do at time t2, then whatever you do at time t2 is not up to you. I don't see why I should accept that. I don't know a lot of things I'll do tomorrow, but when that event occurs, I'm going to have control over it. So I don't really see any reason to accept that. Then premise 2, for any undetermined event that takes place, you cannot know how it will occur occur. Okay, fine. X is an undetermined event. Okay, agent A does not know whether they will do X at T2 until after the event takes place. Well, why can't it be while the event is taking place? I'm knowing what I'm doing. So, so event X taking place is, yeah, so this agent A to premise 4 and premise 1, I just completely reject.
Right. So I think in order to motivate premise 4, I'm going to want to say that in order for something to be the cause of X, it must temporally precede X, I think. And so that's a case in which you couldn't know whether you do X or not, and until after it occurs. And so you couldn't be the cause of it. Yeah, like I said, I think I'll need to like reformulate this so that it's actually like logically valid. Because right now it's very much a mishmash.
Yeah, I think I've heard of this argument before, and I find it pretty implausible seeming, but maybe it's better.
Right. Would you like in order to get through this argument, do you have to deny that every event has a preceding cause, like a temporally preceding cause?
Well, I would say a choice is, how would we put it, concurrent. So when I'm making the choice, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's in part temporal because it takes place over temporal moments, but at that very millisecond or nanosecond that I'm making the choice, I'd say that's just a concurrent action. So it wouldn't be temporally prior. It would just be on its own. But me knowing what choice I'm going to make, that just seems to have nothing to do with free will. As far as I can tell, it's just like, no, I don't know the choices I'm going to make, but that's just because I don't know what I'm going to be presented with tomorrow. It wouldn't thereby follow that I don't.
It doesn't even have to be tomorrow, like in the very next second.
Okay, well, fine. Okay, but fine. Like, if I knew in the next second you're going to start screaming at me, I might know what in general I would do. Like in that moment, I would say, well, this is how I don't know. It just, again, it seems like an even weaker version of the random luck type objection. Like, or again, it just seems to beg the question, in my view, against agent libertarian free will. But let's go to the next one.
Well, I was just thinking that, like, maybe for a libertarian that holds to like a temporal understanding of causation, somebody like perhaps Richard Swinburne, some sort of development of this argument could maybe have some sort of like sway over them. Especially since Richard Swinburne's an open theist too, isn't he? So he would agree that with premise 2, for any undetermined event that takes place, you cannot know prior to its taking place how it will occur. And then he would also agree that causes must temporally precede effects. Yeah. I guess he would probably just have to deny that first premise. If you do not know what you will do at T2, then whatever you do at T2 is not going to be up to you. Or he would. Yeah, I'm wondering how to maybe like rephrase that to sort of like get past somebody's motivations or intuitions. All right, do you want to move on? Let me. All right, let me.
So while you're working on that, I'm going to field John's question here. Or I'm assuming it's John. So Catholicism doesn't, as far as I know, formally pronounce on libertarian free will. I mean, there are some Catholics like Thomas that probably lean more towards like a compatibilist type understanding. But I do think the tradition of Catholicism is implicitly in support of libertarian free will. But like the Catechism 1730 says, God created man a rational being, conferring on him the dignity of a person who can initiate and control his own actions. Now, you could say that's, compatibilism, but I mean, I think the natural reading is libertarian free will. But also, man is rational, and therefore, like God, he is created with free will and is master over his acts. So if we assume that God could have chosen not to create the universe and God has free will, then that would seem like at least you could make the case that God has libertarian free will. Now, again, I think a compatibilist could frame those things to be compatible with compatibilism, but yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church doesn't pronounce on like metaphysical disputes, but I would argue that the tradition of Catholicism at least fits well with libertarian free will, but it's not like
it's not a dogma.
And I'm not sure why John is so opposed to all of that, but
me, what are you talking about? Oh, John DePew?
Yeah, not you.
Okay.
Well, let's go ahead and get through this, and maybe we'll do another stream sometime with our Covenantist friends. Or
if anyone has any questions, go ahead, throw them in the chat but I'll go through this last one. This last one is sort of much more laid back than the other two, even more so, I guess. All right, so either X, and X is just going to stand for some free event or something like that, has some explanation as to why it occurred rather than some alternative, in which case there was no possible alternative, or X has no explanation as to why it occurred rather than some alternative, in which case, so this is actually drawing upon like the contrastive explanations, in which case the agent plays no explanatory role in its occurring. Okay, some event either has a contrastive explanation as to why it occurs, and if it does have a contrastive explanation, then it's not going to be the case that it could have occurred otherwise because there's this contrastive explanation. And if it has no contrastive explanation, then I think in which case the agent plays no explanatory role in its occurring. All right, what are your thoughts on that argument?
Well, I can't see all of it, but either X has some explanation of why it occurred rather than some alternative, in which case there was no possible alternative. Well, I would just reject that. I would say, the agent choosing one thing over another, even though they could have chosen the other thing instead, that is the explanation. So I just reject that understanding. Or X has no explanation as to why it occurred, in which case the agent, if there's no explanation, I just think it's incoherent or as to why that person made the choice. It would just seem like it's like, I definitely want to say there is an explanation, but I would just say the explanation simply is the person used their will or the person willed themselves to pick X over Y instead of the other way around. But I can't see what that bottom statement is.
Oh, that's
another argument.
Yeah, that's actually, since while going through this, I was trying to think of like, okay, what does it mean to say something is random? And so this was just a sort of like definition that I sort of came up with, in which case it would actually rule out libertarian freedom.
Okay.
But yeah, that's not part of the argument at all.
Yeah, to me, a lot of this comes down to like how you define random. So a lot of times I'll ask people like, if by random you simply mean not determined by something outside of you, well, then I agree. But all you're saying is what I believe. But if you're by random, you mean it's just like a spasm outside of my control. Well, I disagree, but I don't know why I don't think that's the type of action I'm committing. So, but if, so ultimately it's just kind of this like catch-all word that nobody wants to accept that a choice is random, but I think it's like a pejorative word that's used that it depends upon how you cash out what that word means. By random, you just mean I use my will to pick X over Y. Well, then, yeah, it's random, but that doesn't mean anything. It's just like you're just using a pejorative word to describe a position that you want to reject for the determinist. That's the way I see it. Now, maybe they see it as stronger than that. I'm sure they do, but that's the way I see it.
All right, so I'm kind of surprised by your response because, like, generally, I typically see that, like, as a libertarian, you sort of have to deny that there are these sorts of contrastive explanations for our actions, because it seems like if you have a contrastive explanation for why you do X rather than Y, then as part of the antecedent condition, that's going to necessitate that you do X. That's why, like, in my response, I was saying that, no, there's not a sort of, like, higher motivating, there's not this ultimate motivating factor.
Can you repeat
Yeah.
Can you repeat that? Because I was responding.
No, yeah. If you have a sort of contrastive explanation as to why you do X over Y, then it seems like that's going to be a sort of antecedent condition to you performing X that necessitates you doing so. In which case, determinism would be true.
No, I don't think that there's an antecedent condition. I think there are antecedent interests that you receive, like, oh, I'm tired, or oh, I'm hungry, and you receive those interests, but I don't think those determine it. I think the action itself is concurrently willed or determined by the agent themselves, and they are thereby the sufficient explanation of why they chose X and not Y, even though they could have chosen Y and not X. They are that final and sufficient explanation.
Okay, so it wouldn't be an antecedent condition, it would be a sort of concurrent condition.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're antecedent interests that you concurrently select from.
All right, so maybe we can sort of reformulate this argument then to say, like, prior to X's occurring, either there is some explanation as there's some contrastive explanation as to why X will occur over some alternative, or there is no explanation as to why it will occur over some alternative. And either
how do you define then contrastive?
Right, it would just mean something that makes it the case rather than some other thing, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think depending upon how it gets understood, I think there is a contrastive explanation. The explanation just simply is that's how you used your will.
Well, hold on. I'm saying prior to its occurring, would there be a contrastive explanation?
No.
Okay, so then you wouldn't have some sort of reason to do X over Y prior to performing.
You don't have a necessitating reason, but your reason, you do have your reason. You have a again, I would look at the reasons as like the interests that you receive. Like, oh, I could study math because I want to pass this test, or I could get more sleep. And depending upon what is the best reason to pursue is up to you, depending upon what you want to achieve in life and such. But so there is an explanation, but there's no determining. There's no ultimately determine.
Right.
Your set of interests are determined, but you don't. Your ultimate selection is willed by you.
There wouldn't be a contrastive explanation prior to its occurring, though.
I guess not, but I don't see the problem with that.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to remember why, because I'm not sure that my sort of like entailment really follows. Either okay, so if X has no explanation as to why it occurred rather than some alternative. In which case the agent plays no explanatory role in its occurring. Maybe it's like something like an agent only acts if they have contrastive reasons to perform some action, but I don't think that's true. But like it seems like maybe that's what this argument is sort of presupposing. Yeah, I think of the three arguments, I want to develop further this one. But you're right. I'll have to figure out a good motivation for premise one, that if you don't know what you will do, then if you do not know what you will do prior to its occurring, then it's not going to be up to you how it occurs. And I think that might actually be, yeah, I'd really want to like, especially compare this argument to like Richard Swinburne's sort of case for free will, given his account of causation and given his account of like God's foreknowledge of the future of future contingent acts, because it seems like maybe he's going to want to say that human beings can have some knowledge that God can't have, which seems like you're going to sort of like negate God's omniscience in some sense.
Well, Swinburne's an open theist.
Right. Right. But it seems like if he wants to say that the agent themselves does have control over their actions, then they're going to have to know what they will do prior to their performing that action, in which case they know something that God doesn't know, because God wouldn't have any way in which to know what's going to occur.
Well, that's going to be a different issue about like foreknowledge and such, but I think we've talked about that before, where I think, like, I mean, well, one, assuming, open theism or something like that, then I would just say God and the agent know at the same time. Then under that scenario, it just, until there is something to be known, then God wouldn't know it, is what the open theist would say.
Right. Okay. So, well, maybe you could say, especially if you accept sort of Swinburne's account of causation, where causes must temporally precede effects, then it seems like in order for God's knowledge to occur due to the agent deciding to perform some event, then God's knowledge must temporally, what's the opposite of precede? Antecede? Follow, I guess. God's knowledge would have to follow the agent's actually knowing, in which case there would be one moment of time in which the agent knows X, whereas God does not know X, in which case God would not be omniscient. Of course, I guess, like, if you're
I think under the open theist view, they're going to say God reads minds, so he's going to know at the same time.
But God's reading, well, it wouldn't be at the same time given Richard Swinburne's account of causation. It would have to be.
Maybe. I don't know. Well,
in which case, but even then, like, the open theist is still going to say that God can know all possible things, and they'll just say it's impossible for God to know what you're going to do at the same moment in which you decide what you're going to do. God could only know it afterwards, in which case that would be compliant with that definition of omniscience.
Right. And just to clarify, John and I aren't open theists, or at least I'm not. But okay, well, unless you have something else, I want to end it to not keep this too long. But I know Apocalypse here wanted to hash out some stuff, but I think we'll have to do that on another stream because I wanted to keep this one under an hour. Okay, but if people have objections and such, go ahead and leave them in the comment section. I know it's not everybody agrees on libertarian free will, but it seems evident to me that we have it.
And I feel like just as confident in my argument that I gave earlier on this channel against Ben Watkins, because like I've gotten some more responses to it, and it still seems very obvious to me that there are some situations in which I ought to have done otherwise than what I ended up doing, and that still implies can in a sort of like ontologically weighty sort of way. But if you want to see that, watch the debate I did with Ben Watkins from earlier.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and I hope people have a good night.